Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
17 degrees here on this Tuesday, January 21st. Good morning, I'm Brian O'Neill, on with Dr. Gary Ostrower, who's calling in from Olean. The Olean area, I should say, St. Bonaventure, which is technically in the town of Allegheny over there. Dr. Ostrower, just quickly, how are the roads?
Fair, I would say. It was Route 86 was really pretty good. Some of the local roads were a little bit less good. But hey, this is winter, and it's a relatively mild winter, I guess, as these things go.
Dr. Ostrower, before we get, let's start right away with impeachment. I'm wondering, though, did you watch the Bill Clinton impeachment, and did you watch the Nixon impeachment?
I watched both as much as I could. You know, when I say as much as I could, I was working, didn't have a chance to watch, everything. But sure, I paid a lot of attention to both of those.
And they say in this one they're going to be using the Clinton impeachment model. What does that mean to you?
Well, they're using the Clinton impeachment model in some ways, and not in all ways. What Mitch McConnell seems to be saying, if I understand, is that with Clinton McConnell is saying there were no witnesses, and therefore there are going to be no witnesses here. But in fact, for the Clinton, there really were witnesses. I think that you have to be very, very kind of skeptical about a good deal of what McConnell is saying. And I might also add that the Clinton impeachment, and by the way, when we talk about impeachment, let me, if I may, try to clarify things that a lot of people still don't fully understand. Many of us do, but many of us don't. Impeachment has two phases. The House of Representatives impeaches a president, and not only a president. There have been about 15 impeachments altogether, impeachment trials. So the House can impeach someone. It can be any federal officer, and that includes, of course, judges. And most of the people who have ever been impeached by the House of Representatives have been judges. However, there were three episodes in the past where the House attempted to impeach a president. One was Andrew Johnson back in the 1860s, in 1867 and 1868. The second was Richard Nixon in 1974, and the third, of course, was Bill Clinton in 1999. And this also gets a little bit confusing because with the Clinton impeachment, while the House of Representatives did vote impeachment rules against him, by the same token, the Senate never had the trial. And the Senate never had the trial because normally what the Constitution says is that the House will impeach, and then the trial itself is held in the Senate. And then if the federal officer is convicted, that federal officer is removed, is not punished in any other way, not put into jail, not fined, but merely removed from office. If that happens, of course, then the president would presumably no longer be president. In the case of Andrew Johnson, back in the 1860s, the trial failed by a single vote to remove him from office. In the case of Richard Nixon, there was no trial. And the reason there was no trial is because, as I think most of our listeners know, Nixon resigned. A number of Republican senators, including Hugh Scott from Pennsylvania, Barry Goldwater from Arizona, people who had been very, very supportive of the president until the very end of that whole process, told him that, in light of information that had been gleaned from the tapes, the so-called smoking gun, the Senate was going to convict him, and therefore he should resign before the trial, and Nixon did exactly that. In the case of Bill Clinton, the House of Representatives did indeed, impeach him. The trial was held in the Senate, and by a vote of 45 against Clinton and 55 in support of Clinton, he was not removed from office. So, that's kind of the background. And in fact, in some ways, there are parallels. In some ways, there are not parallels in respect to what Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican Majority Leader, is seeking to do over here. One way that there is not, where we're not seeing a parallel, is that Senator McConnell is trying to condense this entire process into 2 days, and the 2 days will include approximately 12 hours of hearings in the Senate. Why only in 2 days? Well, I think in part because he really does want to speed up the whole process, and I think that a lot of Democrats, especially those who are running for president, would just as well have that process speeded up as well. But I think there's another issue here, and that is that we're already suffering a certain amount of impeachment fatigue, and I think that Senator McConnell understands full well that most Americans are not going to watch 24 hours of impeachment proceedings. Certainly, 12 hours each that extend into the wee hours of the morning, probably into 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning. We're simply not going to do it, and I think it's part of what many of McConnell's critics would call McConnell's efforts to cover up the crimes of the so-called high crimes, if you will, of President Trump.
Dr. Ostrower, a lot of videos, old videos are surfacing from the 1990s. There's a video of Donald Trump in 1999 saying that Ken Starr is a lunatic, and I think we all kind of forget that prior to running for president, Trump was actually close with the Clintons. Then there's videos that have surfaced of Senator Schumer saying things that contradict what he said today, and others when they're talking about the Bill Clinton impeachment versus the Trump impeachment. I wanted to get your thoughts on President Trump using Ken Starr. I think the choice of Alan Dershowitz is probably a smart one because I think a lot of conservatives these days like Dershowitz because Dershowitz has come to the president's defense many times. How about Ken Starr? How do you think that both Trump's base and the people who don't like Trump will feel about Ken Starr being chosen?
Well, Starr carries a lot of baggage. I think that Trump's base probably will be very enthused about Starr. Starr was, of course, the chief critic of President Clinton during the impeachment hearings back in 1999. In that sense, he became something of a Republican hero. By the same token, he was a villain from the perspective of many of the Democrats. So, yeah, he does carry baggage. He's a very, very smart guy. On the other hand, that baggage I'm talking about includes his removal as president of Baylor University because he attempted to, or participated, I should say, in covering up a sex scandal among some members of the athletic teams, especially the football players. So, here's a guy who, on one hand, is going to be, telling us that that President Trump is free of any corrupt activity, corrupt thoughts, corrupt practices, and yet, he has, I think, some questionable past in that respect. I don't mean that he himself is corrupt per se, but he certainly tried to cover this up when he was at Baylor, and that's why he was removed as president of the university. I think that there's a fundamental issue here, and I think it's going to be probably raised on day one of this impeachment trial. And the fundamental issue is, did the president commit an impeachable crime? Everyone knows that President Trump, at this point at least, we all know that he was involved in corrupt practices. We all know that he tried to extort the Ukrainian government with $391 million of $391 million in military aid, that he would hold this up unless the Ukrainian government investigated Hunter Biden and therefore Joe Biden, in other words, the president's rival, one of his rivals for president. Okay, is that an impeachable crime? That's the real issue here. And what many of the Republicans are arguing, and I think that Alan Dershowitz is going to articulate this probably more seriously than anyone else, he's going to essentially argue that unless an actual crime. An actual crime has been committed. There was a felony offense, not a misdemeanor, not a parking violation, but a felony offense. Unless such a felony offense has been committed, there is no basis for impeachment. What the Democrats are going to argue, and I think they have a very, very strong case, is that abuse of power does not necessarily involve the commission of a felony offense, of a felony crime. If you go back to the Founding Fathers, the way in which they're going to essentially articulate all of this, what the Founding Fathers argued when they put the impeachment clauses into the Constitution, what they were essentially arguing is that, that abuse of power is unacceptable. And they're going to articulate this most importantly in Federalist Paper number 1, which was written by Alexander Hamilton, and then again in Federalist Paper number 65, once again a Federalist paper that was written by Hamilton. And when I talk about the Federalist Papers, just in the event that someone out there is not quite sure what I'm referring to, these were a series of publications written by Hamilton, by James Madison, and also by John Jay, a series of relatively short publications that essentially argued the case for this new Constitution in 1787, and that would be ratified in 1788 by many of the states. And what those Federalist Papers argued, especially in Federalist Paper number 65, is that an impeachable offense is an offense against society itself. And he makes clear in Federalist Paper number 65 that impeachment can be for misconduct by public men, and secondly, and I'm going to quote here, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. It does not use the word crime. It does not use the word felony. Hamilton, in other words, is talking about abuse of power. And let me give you another example. Okay, this is going to be a kind of a bad analogy, but I think it may help make my point that that a president can be impeached for offenses that are not necessarily crimes. The president, for instance, might be a sleepy guy. Maybe he drinks a little bit too much alcohol. And so he sleeps through cabinet meetings. He sleeps through other meetings with foreign officials and so forth. In other words, the president is simply not doing his job. Maybe he goes on vacation when he should be attending to the affairs of state. Maybe he asks foreign governments to become involved in American affairs in ways that are really improper and even unethical. That may not be a crime per se, but it's certainly a breach of the public trust. Can he be impeached for that? Can he then be convicted or removed from office for that? And I think the Founding Fathers would say unquestionably he could. In other words, I think we're going to have to separate out what is an actual crime versus what is an abuse of power, what is an abuse of the public trust, what is a failure to meet the terms of his oath of office.
Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, Tucker Carlson on Fox last night talked about how the Republicans are getting overconfident about Trump winning re-election. Carlson is warning that with candidates like Bernie Sanders promising student loan forgiveness and similar promises coming from the Sanders camp, Tucker Carlson saying, hey, you know what, the Republicans need to have their guard up a little bit more and not think that they're just going to easily win in November. What do you make of that analysis from Tucker Carlson, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, I think that Carlson, from my perspective, is, I'd say, wrong about 80% of the time. And in this particular case, he may be that 20% when he's right. Look, when it comes to overconfidence, both parties, I think, have reason not to be overconfident. I think that President Trump has all of the tools, so to speak, that any incumbent has. And that includes, of course, the bully pulpit. It includes his ability to reach the public, whether through tweeting or whether through formal addresses such as a State of the Union message, through press conferences and so forth. It's tough to beat an incumbent president. On the other hand, incumbent presidents have lost elections. Think about George H.W. Bush in 1992. So, and I think that, needless to say, President Trump is a very, very controversial president, and he's one who has, at least from my own perspective, committed impeachable offenses. I mean, he's not going to be removed from office. The Republicans in the Senate, for the most part, are completely in his corner, and he says something, they believe it, no matter how untrue it may be. They'll continue to repeat what I consider to be his falsehoods, even his lies. And I think, I was listening this morning, for instance, to Fox News, where a former Speaker of the House of Representatives, a Republican, Newt Gingrich, was saying that, look, there is nothing there, that the president has committed no offenses. If he had committed offenses, it would have said so in the Mueller report, and the Mueller report did not in any way suggest that the president had committed an offense. Well, that is simply not true. I mean, what Newt Gingrich said is absolutely untrue, and yet many, many people continue to believe it. The Mueller report indicated 10 different instances where the president had obstructed justice, and it concluded that if the president were innocent, we would have said so in the report. Well, of course, the report did not say that he was innocent. And so, I think the president has a lot to answer for, but he does have a base that is, views him almost in cult proportions. There are an awful lot of people who I think are enjoying a degree of prosperity, at least through the stock market, that makes many Americans, I think, very reluctant to change horses in midstream. Most Americans may not be enjoying the stock, the prosperity that the stock market would suggest. But the fact of the matter is that I think that the president stands a very, very good chance of winning the election. Can the things that Bernie Sanders is saying, really matter? I think this. If Bernie Sanders is the Democratic candidate for president in 2020, he is going to get crushed by President Trump. Trump is going to argue, and remember, Trump is not necessarily very kind to his opponents. He's often insulting. He's often untruthful, but he's going to essentially that Bernie Sanders is not simply a socialist. He's going to call him a communist. He's going to show these photos of Bernie Sanders supporting the Sandinistas, rebels way down in Nicaragua back during the 1980s and so forth. I think that the Democrats would be committing political suicide if they supported Sanders. I think there is none of these Democratic candidates, whether we're talking about 22 of them or only 4 of them who are, really serious at this point. I think that the president would like to run against no one more than he would like to run against Bernie Sanders. I think that Sanders is the most vulnerable of all of these candidates. The one candidate who I think could really give the president a heck of a run for his money and probably defeat him is Amy Klobuchar.
I thought you were going to say that, Dr. Ostrower.
But Klobuchar is a moderate, and many members, the Democrats, not the ones who vote in the general election, but the ones who are going to vote in the primaries tend to be somewhat more progressive, somewhat more left wing than Klobuchar, and consequently, she is simply not getting the attention that she deserves, and she's certainly not getting the kind of money that she deserves, and yet she's a very, very credible candidate.
Let's take a quick break here on the Newsmaker show. When we get back, I'd like to talk to Dr. Ostrower about MLK. It was the MLK holiday yesterday. I want to talk about the civil rights period with Dr. Ostrower as he lived through it. We'll be back in just a moment.
Do you need physical therapy for an injury or illness? It's here. St. James Hospital has a brand new PT clinic. With state-of-the-art therapy and fitness equipment, we can address all your PT needs, such as joint and back pain, work and sports injuries, concussions, vertigo, Parkinson's and stroke care, arthritis and fibromyalgia, and much more. Best of all, you'll get personalized one-on-one care from one of our experienced, friendly team. Same-day and walk-in appointments are available. Call 385-3790 or visit stjames.urmc.edu. you.
And on this cold and snowy morning, checking in with meteorologist Gary Best. Gary, how's today look? How's the rest of the week look as well?
Well, today looks, of course, cold and a little bit snowy, some scattered snow showers around, but the rest of the week looks pretty good. This morning, sunrise was at 7:35. It'll set at 5:09 later on today, and we'll have clouds with occasional sun breaking through. Any light snow or flurry should be ending through this morning, and about 30 to 33 degrees during this afternoon. Tonight, back to some clouds, about 15 to 20, but noticeably milder on Wednesday. Sun and clouds, we're back up to near 40 then, down to 20 at night, and Thursday, partly sunny skies, mid-40s, and about 45 to 50, it looks like, on Friday.
Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, again, yesterday was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. A lot, people know, I think, basically, they know about MLK, and they know about the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. But if you look through the list of civil rights assassination victims, it goes on. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of them.
Well, that goes back in some ways to the to the mid 1950s. You're quite right. I think that many people know that there were 3 civil rights workers killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and that was in 1963. A fellow by the name of Goodman, another by the name of Schwerner, and a third by the name of Cheney. It was featured then and publicized, highly publicized, some years later in a movie called Mississippi Burning. Without that movie, I think that most Americans would certainly have forgotten about even those 3 people. There was 4 little girls who were killed in a bombing in 1963. I believe it was in April or May of 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. There were civil rights marches. For instance, the Selma March, the famous Selma March in 1965, where there was a woman by the name of Viola Liuzzo, and a minister by the name of James Reeb. Both of them actually were white, not black. They were killed. There's a long, long list of people who should be on that civil rights memorial, and many of them whose names I don't know, and many of them who were kind of forgotten to history. It's a sad chapter in American history, and I think you know a little bit more about that because of some of your own contacts in the South, in subsequent years.
Yeah, I worked in Georgia 2004 and 2005, and there was a very interesting older salesman, an African American named Frank Dean Martin, great guy, and he talked about when he knew the Kings because he was a reporter and a photographer in both Atlanta and Macon, and he told a very interesting story about Jimmy Carter. He said when Jimmy Carter was in Georgia politics, Jimmy Carter would always bring Frank Dean Martin up to the front of the line of the reporters, give him a photograph, and give him a scoop. And that was something you did not do in Georgia back then in the 60s. And they had a lot of good... Frank Dean Martin and the other African-Americans that I worked with in Macon, Georgia, had a lot of really good feeling about Jimmy Carter because of things like that.
Well, look, I mean, Carter was the exception to the rule, and I think that he proved it when he was president. I think he was a much better president than his reputation would suggest. And that reputation was really seriously sullied by the Iran hostage crisis of 1979 and 1980. But going back to the issue of civil rights, what I find ironic is that, you have for many, many years, and let's go all the way back to the early 19th century, you had a tradition in the United States of expanding the terms of democracy. Initially, for instance, only adult white men who owned property. Not only who owned property, but who owned property and were also members of the Puritan Church could vote. And then eventually they removed the requirement for church membership. And then back during the Jacksonian period of the 1820s and the 1830s and into the 1840s, they removed the requirements for property qualifications. And then eventually in the latter part of the 19th century, they began to expand the vote to women, initially on a state basis and then in 1919 on a national basis. And then from 1919 until the 1960s, you kind kind of entered into that phase, especially during the 50s and the 60s, where we focused on race. And so people who had been denied the right to vote on the basis of the color of their skin were now granted the right to vote. And, of course, that made a huge difference in respect to the people elected as mayors of, local officials or whatnot, not only in the South but in northern cities as well. Today, what you have, and again, I think that there's a partisan issue here, you have the Republican Party no longer trying to expand the right to vote. They're trying to reduce the right to vote, to constrict it. And you see this, for instance, in the way in which the Supreme Court is now dealing with the Civil Rights Voting Act of 1965. You see it with these efforts at what we call voter suppression in states like Wisconsin, in states like Georgia. In other words, where Republicans are trying to remove people from the voting rolls, people who are, for the most part, lower class, people who are likely to vote, more likely to vote Democratic than Republican. And so I think it's a real, in some ways, an undermining, a reversal of the American democratic tradition. I think it's going to make this country somewhat less democratic than it has been in the past.
Dr. Ostrower, with that, we have to go. Always good having you on. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Talk to you next week.